Hello, welcome to our internet audience, everyone who's tuning in for this installment of the Women and Gender Performance Lecture Series. My name is Melissa Craddock. I am curator at the Bade Museum. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to turn the floor to my Bade Museum colleague, Associate Curator Brooke Norton, to read a statement on behalf of the museum.
We would like to begin by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Huichil, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenye Ohlone. We respect the land and the people who have stewarded it throughout many generations, and we honor their elders both past and present. We are living in a moment that warrants deep reflection on our past and present. Across many global contexts, equal access to healthcare, education, fair wages, and human rights is contested on the basis of sex and gender identity. In an effort to bring light to these timely issues, to serve a broader public audience online, and to connect to the local community that it serves, the museum is taking action to become a more inclusive, welcoming, and equitable institution that practices the philosophy of radical inclusion adopted by its parent institution, Pacific School of Religion. One of these steps is the creation of public programming. Through this lecture series, we hope to highlight new and established scholars who are engaging with risky and marginalized topics concerning women, gender performance, and sexuality in the past. We invite you to participate in these programs so that together we can listen, learn, and work towards creating a more inclusive museum community. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Brooke. It is now my great honor and pleasure to introduce today's very special speaker, Erin Brody. Erin Brody is the Robert and Catherine Riddell Professor of Bible and Archaeology and Director of the Bade Museum at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. He has excavated primarily at harbor sites in Israel, including Tel Nami, Ashkelon, Dor, and Tel Akko, and participated in projects in the Negev and Akko Plain, and with the Ohlone Muwekma at sites in Northern California. He's held fellowships at the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem and the American Center for Oriental Research in Amman. Recent publications have focused on household religion, metallurgy, and interregional trade at Tel Nasbe from holdings in the Bade and Rockefeller museums. He's a co-editor of a brand new volume titled No Place Like Home, Ancient Near Eastern Houses and Households, which was just published last month by Archaeopress. Other research is focused on specialized religion of Canaanite and Phoenician seafarers. It is out of this background, plus some time affiliated with the Rekanati Institute for Maritime Studies at the University of Haifa, that ideas have developed, leading to today's presentation. So with that very exciting introduction, Erin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Melissa and Brooke. And one of the great things about being where I am is working with amazing staff people. And so I just want to put a big shout out to the Bade Museum staff, both present and past, for all the great work that they've done. And also a thank you to our co-sponsor, the Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley, who've done such a wonderful job co-hosting this series and our last two Zoom series from previous years. I'm going to take a second and share my screen. And then I will get on with today's presentation. Maybe if I could just do a brief check-in and make sure from staff members that they can see the image on the screen. Great, I'm getting a thumbs up. Recent research into underwater finds from locations off of the northern coast of Israel and the southern coast of Lebanon has defined these marine assemblages as ritual deposits. Hundreds of ceramic figurines were discovered submerged beneath the waters of the Mediterranean at both Shavet Zion, a locus located between the more prominent urban settlements of Akko and Akziv, and at a location northwest of Tyre. Geographically and culturally, these sites fall within the regions of Phoenicia in the late Iron Age, Persian, and Hellenistic periods. Despite early interpretations of both sites as the remnants of shipwrecks, no wooden hull remains or other variety of ubiquitous cargo was discovered at either site. Date ranges of finds from either location, the 7th to 3rd centuries BCE at Shavet Zion and 6th to 4th centuries BCE at Tyre, indicate gradual deposition of artifacts over extended periods of time, rather than wreck incidents at either site. And if you look at these images here up on the screen, you can see the locations of both of these underwater finds, basically in the central part of the Eastern Mediterranean coast. And then, of course, you can see a more focused map on the, at least one proposal for the ancient homeland of Phoenicia and how that is right along the Mediterranean coast of the modern states of Lebanon, of course, the heartland, going further south into modern day Israel, and further north into modern day Syria. So that helps to kind of locate us in terms of the geography. And I've already mentioned the time periods represented by both of these finds. Differences between the Shavet Zion and Tyre deposits remain in terms of the gender of the figurines found at each site. The approximately 250 to 300 figurines of several types from Shavet Zion are all female. The choroplastic finds from nearby Tyre, numbering over 300, are dominated by female figurines, but male statuettes are present as well. I propose that these gender differences from either underwater locus represents differences in ritual performances that took place at either site. While it is not possible to fully equate female figurines with ritual use of these artifacts solely by women or male figurines by men, it is evident that the status of the female figurines, many of which are depicted as pregnant or holding a baby, represents aspects of women's profane and ritual concerns involving the prenatal period, perinatal phase, and care for very young children. These figurines represent uniquely female traits. While it is likely that women's rituals were conducted at both sites, Shavet Zion is unique in that it was solely a locale associated with women's religious culture and rites, pertaining thereto and conducted at sea. So in this image, you can see some of the assemblages, of course, from both sites, which have remarkable similarities, but then, of course, their own unique qualities. The main difference being, while female figurines, of course, dominate the corpus from Tyre, they're also male representations as well. Whereas at the site located a little bit further to the south at Shavet Zion, the corpus is entirely female. So I'd just like to take a moment and lift up the work of Carol Myers, whose definition I'm really basing this idea of women's religious culture on. And so I'll just read a quote from her work from the little volume called Households of Holiness, the Religious Culture of Israelite Women. But I think we can see some wonderful parallels here in the neighboring Phoenician world. So to quote Dr. Myers, women's religious practices can thus be seen as strategies akin to preventative and restorative medical procedures of the modern world, to intervene with the divine forces believed to impact the well-being of mother and child, and to influence them in order to assure their benevolent and protective presence, or to avert their destructive powers. The rituals surrounded pregnancy, labor, and birth, along with those securing fertility before pregnancy and those dealing with postpartum lactation, infant care, and circumcision, constitute the religious culture of women more than of men. So I think that, again, this concept is very important, and it's not, of course, just applicable to ancient Israelite culture. This, of course, has been shown through numerous modern anthropological studies of living traditional cultures as well, but also can be seen kind of in a snapshot in the images, which are a little bit pixelated, but that I've depicted on this slide from what used to be called Phoenician bowls. There's not much in the world called Phoenician anymore, and we'll get to that in just a second. But bowls, of course, that are distributed throughout the first millennium Mediterranean and go as far, east as Iran, but may have had their origins, again, on the Levantine coast somewhere or in a Phoenician colony. But all three of these depicted, and there are more in the corpus, show processions and musical performances that are entirely gendered female. Now, who is being worshipped or being celebrated in these bowls, of course, is up to, like many other things, interpretation, whether this is a high status female or is a female deity remains in conjecture. But the fact that all of these depictions are gendered solely female, I think, is important, and again is a representation of women's religious culture. General studies on Phoenician culture have blossomed in recent years. Since Maria Obey's book was published in the early 1990s, there are a score of new volumes by individuals and multiple authors in various research languages. Yet there has been very little attention in these more synthetic treatments to topics related to Phoenician women or gender performance. These more specific studies are found in a handful of articles in specialized journals, many focused on the Western Mediterranean. They were also the topic of a conference in, Tübingen, Germany. Several of those papers have been published, and also have been the topic of, topics delivered at professional meetings that have yet to be published. And here I'd like to shout out especially to Helen Dixon's recent ASOR papers, several of which are in the pipeline for publication. So the topic is still really in its nascence, despite a decent set of data in terms of material culture, representational, and textual evidence. So, the data is there, it's fairly widespread, and of course, located in different corpora, but I think there's still a lot of rich work to be done on the topic. And I hope that this is one small contribution today. One should also be aware of recent challenges to the use of the term Phoenician as a cultural descriptor to preface the presentation of materials found at sites in the homeland, along the Levantine littoral, or in various locations of colonized sites throughout the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts of Iberia and Morocco. For convenience's sake, I'm retaining the use of Phoenician as an edict descriptor used in classical texts to differentiate peoples from the Levant and their daughter colonies from the first millennium, which has come into modern usage in a somewhat uncritical fashion, borrowed from ancient classical writings. Recent considerations have deemed Phoenician and its Latin derivative Punic an appropriate appellation for groups that share variations of a Northwest Semitic language, material culture, religious concepts and practices, and economic networks, despite, of course, the drawbacks of this terminology utilized by outsider classical groups with all of their inherent ancient biases. And I think especially the language and material cultural remains are really important here for distinguishing. Of course, there are variations within the Phoenician language itself, dialectal dialectic differences between the main city-states, fairly minor though. And certainly there was a major language barrier between these Levantine people as they spread out in the Mediterranean and encountered, for instance, Greek speakers, eventually Latin speakers, et cetera, et cetera. So while the language is a Northwest Semitic language, closely related to, of course, Biblical Hebrew, other Canaanite languages, Ammonite, Edomite, et cetera. Those are more dialectical differences, and much more closely related than, of course, languages from different language groups. Of course, language is not the only evidence we have for ancient identity, but also there were material cultural similarities that linked these people. So, for instance, there's a daughter settlement along the Moroccan coast at Mogador, where the material culture is very similar to that of the homeland, and that's an incredible distance. So they clearly were carrying their home culture with them, regardless of what they were calling themselves. And of course, their identities were primarily to the city from which they came, and of course, its surrounding territories. But even that, of course, that sort of notion of homeland was carried with. We have evidence, for instance, that even from the most famous daughter city, which is Carthage, or the new city in the Western Mediterranean, that there were yearly celebrations where there was a return to Tyre, for instance. So there was a return to the homeland. So that sense of identity is there, even if we don't have that kind of group notion, at least the way moderns would like it to be. And of course, we don't have the internal evidence for what these folks were calling themselves as a group either. Anyway, we'll continue and use the word Phoenician, really the Greek word for this people group, because it's better than most of the alternatives. Anyway, the underwater finds from off of the coast near Tyre and Shavet Zion are unique. Despite the ubiquitous nature of the locations of Phoenician settlements along coastal littorals and islands from the homeland to outside the Straits of Gibraltar, some comparisons can be drawn to the finds of offerings from underwater at locations around the island of Gader, now Cadiz, in southwestern Spain, and to votive metal hoards uncovered at various loci under the Bay of Cadiz. These far western discoveries, however, do not represent the same sort of concentration of ceramic figurines as the ones in the East, and have been explained by their proximity to coastal temples or related to ritual concerns after earthquakes and resulting tsunamis. In comparison, the Levantine find spots are not related to any known terrestrial temples and are generally interpreted as marine loci for offerings from ritual performed in fulfillment of vows related to aspects of everyday concerns. So as far as we can tell then, these finds from the East are relatively unique. There may be some materials actually also from Cadiz that I haven't had a chance to further investigate, which would balance this out a bit. But I just haven't had access to those publications, unfortunately. The terracotta figurines found underwater near Tyre were scattered along the seafloor more than 4 kilometers northwest of the settlement. The area was previously looted, and numerous barnacle-encrusted figurines have appeared on the international antiquities market. Despite these disturbances, however, over 300 figurines were found scattered across the sandy and rocky seafloor during several seasons of excavation in the early 2000s. And so if you look at this slide in the lower right-hand corner, you can see an aerial view of the city of Tyre, which of course at that time was an island, but there's since been a tombolo that has developed around that, the mole that Alexander had built. And then you can see the location over 4 kilometers, mostly to the west, but a little bit to the north of the city of these underwater finds. And then of course, in these other slides, you can see what the bottom of the sea looks like, not quite reef, not quite sand, a little bit of both. And then some of the figurines actually still in situ. And of course, the numbers would have been even larger if the site hadn't been looted over time. While statistics are not provided breaking down these 300 plus figurines numerically, the excavator divides the group into 3 main types. The majority of these statuettes are female, either pregnant or nursing a young child, while there are 2 male figurine types, one in an attitude of prayer or benediction, and the other rendered in an archaic style. None of the female figurines has any symbols associated with them. One of the male figurines was inscribed Eshmun Yeten, which may be interpreted as a prayer to the Phoenician healing god, Eshmun, presumably fulfilled in part by the deposit of that motive. Many of the female figurines have a miniature bowl-like feature at the feet of the figure that is part of the statuette. These features may have served as a place to light incense, as part of the ritual performed before depositing the figurine in the sea. While the gender of the figurines discovered underwater near Tyre is mixed, it is important to note the excavator's interpretation that the group emphasizes female statuettes, especially ones that are represented as pregnant or nursing. This prominence of female votive offerings, ritually deposited in a specific location at sea, portraying women in a state of pregnancy or the care or feeding of young children, is also found over 30 kilometers to the south. Also underwater, less than a kilometer offshore at a site called Shavet Zion. But before I focus in on Shavet Zion, I just wanted to take a moment, and here you can see in the slide with images focused on the finds from off of the city of Tyre. Again, you can see just a handful of examples of female figurines, but also balancing out a bit with the minority of male figurines that were found. And also an important reminder, you can see there 2 fragments of storage jars. So it's not just the figurines that are being deposited. And we'll see this as well. It was highlighted in an important recent publication of materials from Shavet Zion, that these figurines are also being found with other kinds of goods that are being offered, primarily storage jars, but sometimes juglets and other just profane, pottery vessels. So moving south to Shavet Zion, the underwater finds discovered near Shavet Zion on the northern coast of modern Israel present interesting parallels and differences with the immersed figurines from Tyre. The location of Shavet Zion is not near any contemporary ancient settlement. Instead, the site is about equidistant from the important contemporary Phoenician cities of Akziv, approximately 9 kilometers to its north, and Akko, around 8 kilometers to its south. While the artifacts submerged near Tyre were found 4.5 kilometers northwest of the ancient city, the Shavet Zion figurines were concentrated less than a kilometer offshore. The white cliffs that descend directly into the Mediterranean at Rosh Hanikra, Ras El Nakura, are visible from out at sea off of Shavet Zion, and the figurines were offered to the waters just to the northwest of the outlet of a seasonal river, the Nahal Beit Emek. At the juncture of this river with the sea, a Byzantine church has been excavated possibly marking the site of an earlier seaside shrine, covered or obliterated by later monumental building activities. So I'm just trying to contextualize, of course, these underwater finds from off of Chave Tzion, the location of which you can see in the left-hand bathymetric slide. It's the lower red star. And then in the middle map, you can see its location, again, about equidistant from Akziv to its north and Tel Akko to its south. Probably not quite as visible from these Google Maps images are the fact that, from off of the coast, actually from the coast, you can see at Chave Tzion, you can see the cliffs at Rosh Hanikra, Razo Nakura, which may have had some kind of landscape influence in the choosing of this location, as it's possible too that the outlet of this freshwater seasonal river, the Nahal Ben Ha'emek, which you can see in the lower right-hand slide where its outlet is, and the fact that these figurines were found fairly within proximity, to that also natural feature, may have been important for the reasoning behind the choice of this particular sacred site. Both the Tyre and Chave Tzion deposits were found on a similar type of seabed, consisting primarily of a sandy bottom and intermittent reef rock. In terms of the finds themselves, each concentration of figurines was accompanied by ceramic utilitarian wares, primarily fragments of storage jars. The gender representations of the Chave Tzion figurines, however, varies from the Tyre assemblage, as it is 100% female. Between 250 to 300 female figurines were uncovered at the site, with no male or other gendered statuettes discovered at Chave Tzion. These numbers may change with the ongoing research and Yasser Landau, now focused on the figurines in particular, after having published a recent study on the accompanying ceramics that was in IJNA in 2020. From a gender perspective, the fact that all of the figurines from Chave Tzion are female is of note and is not replicated among concentrations of contemporary figurines found in sacred Favisse at land sites, nor underwater near Tyre. Thus, I posit that the ritual actions taking place offshore near Chave Tzion were solely related to Phoenician women's religious culture. So if we just take a moment again and focus in on this slide, you can see in the bathymetric map on the left, the fine spots. I should also mention too that these figurines were primarily excavated actually in the early 1970s. There were only preliminary publications provided after that. So Alicia Linder was the principal investigator of those early excavations. And then they primarily have sat in storage. So hats off to the group at Haifa University, or groups actually. There are two different research groups that have been working on these materials for bringing these back into the light, finding, of course, unpublished notes, unpublished objects even, and we look forward to future work on the corpus. And then in the right-hand part of this slide, you can see that important contribution of course, the non-figurine finds from Alicia Linder's excavations, mostly storage jars of these coastal types, primarily from the Persian period. Some have lifespans that can go a little bit earlier, some into the very late Iron Age. Some show some tendencies towards, again, going a little bit later into the early Hellenistic period. But a relatively tight grouping, but again, nothing close to the kinds of concentrations that you would have if this was from a shipwreck, which tend to have, of course, complete finds contemporary ceramics, and then also, finds of related to the feeding of the crew, et cetera, et cetera. So we just don't have that kind of variety and that sort of time capsule effect that you get from shipwrecks. So these are definitely offering loci. So this gendered inference that I've just presented is further reinforced by the symbolism of many of the figurines and by symbols found on these statuettes. Some of the Shavet figurines are depicted as pregnant, others hold babies. Many are molded with hand gestures that suggest a pose of blessing. This symbolism suggests rituals involved with the fulfillment of vows related to the success of a pregnancy, or perhaps purification after an unsuccessful pregnancy, care for or purification of a mother after giving birth, and sanctification of her care for her young child and the child itself. Symbols found on a few of the female figurines, just at Shavet provide further insights into the intersections of both the divine and profane feminine at the site, as the sign of Tanit and the dolphin are also depicted on several statuettes. So, and you can see those statuettes here in the left-hand image, taken from that recent IJNA publication. You can see they are drawn actually. I hope you can see my little cursor arrow there. Highly representative, but these are the drawings. Of course, they're impressed on these mold-made figurines, and then I believe this is the dolphin representation. And then just as parallels, you can see, excuse me, on these images from sacrificial stelae from Carthage and from a coin at Carthage, that kind of intimate link between this symbol, the sign of Tanit, and the dolphin. Again, here you can see the sign of Tanit actually atop the dolphin. And then in this coin image, on one side, we have the sign of Tanit behind a female representation. And then on the right, we have a dolphin. And then also just to point out, in this one sacrificial stela, not only do we have the sign of Tanit and the dolphin, but we also have a steering rudder as well. So I'll get back to some of the seafaring implications in just a second. The symbol called the sign of Tanit in Phoenician studies is an emblem consisting of a triangle surmounted by a straight line and a circle at its peak, and numerous variations to this basic design. Interpretations of who or what the symbol represents vary widely, but as its modern nomenclature indicates, the sign has traditionally been associated with the Phoenician goddess Tanit. The goddess Tanit, likely pronounced Tinit or Thenit, something like that, in antiquity, was the mother of the Carthaginian pantheon of gods and goddesses. Wedded to the chief god of Carthage, Baal-Hamon, Tanit was associated with numerous attributes similar to her classical counterparts. And we know from inscriptions, these included the goddesses Hera and Juno. Tanit was the goddess par excellence of agricultural fecundity and human fertility, protectress of mothers, pregnancy, childbirth, and young children. So again, in this slide, you can see some of those images of this sign that's been associated with the goddess, Tanit, the triangle with the circle on top, and the lines that do look like arms. And of course, later on in time on the important sacrificial stelae were actually anthropomorphized. But it's that kind of direct link between an anthropomorphic representation, a few of which I've thrown up here on this slide, and this schematized representation is quite lacking. I did show that the coin in the previous image where we have a human head, the sign of Tanit, on one side and a dolphin on the other, but that's pretty scant evidence. But I think it's a pretty good fit, but that's as far as we can go. Tanit, however, was also associated with the ritual dedication or sacrifice of newborns and young children, together with her consort Balhamon. These ritual dedications took place in specialized sacrificial burial grounds at Carthage and nearby sites in the Western Mediterranean called Tophets in scholarly studies. In Western Phoenician studies, the goddess Tanit has, in Western Phoenician sites, the goddess Tanit has maritime attributes that include her companion animal, the dolphin. I already showed you some of those images. And she is also associated with the protection of seafarers, ships, and proper navigation. Thus, it is not surprising that besides the symbol of Tanit, a representation of a dolphin is also present on one of the Shabbat figurines. And I also already showed you some of that Carthaginian evidence for the link of the symbol with the dolphin. And then in this slide, which is primarily focused on these child sacrifice burial sites or tophets, you can see again from some of the stelae this important link between the sign of Tanit and boats or ships. There's this sort of tantalizing connection with the maritime world. Here you can see on the left-hand lower image, the sign is depicted right underneath the stern of a vessel. Of course, the stern is the area that was so important for steering or safe navigation. Here in this depiction, also from a sacrificial stela, you can see the sign of Tanit represented at both the stern and the prow of the ship. And then finally, here you can see the prow of a warship, in this case, under the protection of the sign of Tanit. So these kinds of links are definitely present, but especially more visible in the Western evidence. Following recent studies of Phoenician figurines by Barbara Bolognani and other scholars, it is unlikely that these female figurines actually represent a deity. This is in this case, of course, the goddess Tanit. Rather, a preferred interpretation is that the female figurine that include the sign of Tanit represents a female worshiper or a dedicant to the goddess Tanit. One particularly well-preserved figurine is very telling. It depicts a fully robed female with her left arm raised across her chest, with the hand clutched just beneath the chin. Her right hand is raised vertically with the palm open in a gesture of blessing. On her belly, the sign of Tanit is prominently depicted, perhaps representing a pendant worn around the neck of the adherent. So here you can see in the center of this image, a figurine found offshore at Shabbat Zion. On her belly is this sign of Tanit. Here are just some parallel pendants from the site of Ashkelon, actually. So the proposal here is that, and she's fully clothed, which is typically also a representation of humans versus divine feminine is often shown nude in the Near Eastern world. So the proposal is that this is a representation, of a worshiper of Tanit wearing some kind of pendant related to the sign of, or depicting the sign of Tanit. The intersection of a locus of women's religious culture, worshipers of the sign of Tanit, the goddess Tanit, and the sea is tantalizing. Another important symbol of the Phoenician mother goddess Tanit, not present at on the finds from Shabbat Zion, but critical for Phoenician seafarers, was the crescent and disk, or the new moon. For mariners, the new moon, symbol of the goddess Tanit, represented her protection over proper navigation and wayfinding over the seas. Could the new moon and its cycles have also had a special connection with the maritime location of Shavet Zion as sacred space related to the goddess Tanit, or symbolize the correct lunar time to propitiate the deity with ceremonies at sea and rituals fulfilled by the dedication of female figurines in the waters of the Mediterranean. Another possible interpretation of the Shavet Zion deposits comes from a comparison with ritual practices in the classical world. Eris Williams-Reed has recently presented the importance of the sea as a locus of purification for Greek women in relation to religious rituals involving shameful pregnancies. Reed notes in her 2018 Durham University dissertation, and quote, "The Aino Likuthia myth sits within a broader category of myth themes about women who, usually in association with a shameful pregnancy, either jump or are pushed into the sea. Often the women and their children are saved by divine intervention and or undergo a life-saving transformation. In particular, Esther Idenau has convincingly highlighted that the sea plays several important roles in this myth theme. The sea is an appropriate place to cast out fallen women because it is a place of no return. Its waters cleanse the pollution of illegitimate and transgressive acts, and conceptually it functions as a liminal space that facilitates transitions between life stages. Immersion into the sea is clearly an essential component of this myth theme," unquote. Unfortunately, we lack a great deal of Phoenician literature, and most of what we have preserved is found translated, transformed, and embedded in classical texts. So we have no direct written information regarding Phoenician views about the sea, or Phoenician women's interactions with or thoughts about the marine environment. Could the waters around Shavet Zion have been imbued with cleansing properties as an important aspect of women's religious culture that took place at the location? Could this maritime liminal space between the shore and the deep, within sight of fresh water of a river outlet and the white cliffs of Rosh Hanikra, Ras El Nukura, have helped women's transitions from pregnancy to motherhood, or from breastfeeding to parturition? May the goddess Tanit have protected Phoenician women's engagement with the sea in these rites of passage? Or were these dedications and thanks to the goddess Tanit propitiations that were fulfilled by jettisoning statuettes to the bottom of the Mediterranean in proscribed locations? Given the isolated nature of the Shavet Zion finds, kilometers away from the settlements of Ugziv and Akko, I propose that the locus was a maritime pilgrimage site. As part of the ceremonies performed at the spot, people must have traveled by boat in order to finalize their vows, with rituals that ended with depositing figurines and ceramics involved in the ceremonies under the water of the Mediterranean. So here you can see in this image, I've sort of done a composite of my fantasy. Here are the waters, of course, right off Shavet Zion. Here are some Phoenician boats making their way out to the deposition site, perhaps the new moon, indicating the time of the month that was perhaps even time of the year that was appropriate for these maritime ceremonies. At least some, if not the majority, of these dedicants at Shavet Zion must have been women. Women likely transitioning from pregnancy to motherhood, or asking the goddess Tanit, oops, I'm sorry, I've lost my space. Women likely transitioning from pregnancy to motherhood, or asking the goddess Tanit for protection during the vulnerable stages of pregnancy, the birthing process, or breastfeeding young children. The sea and its associations with the goddess Tanit was a liminal place appropriate for cleansing impurities and aiding in a variety of transitions. Like many Phoenician religious beliefs and ritual practices, these maritime aspects of women's religious culture were limited to specific locations, in these instances off of the coast of Tyre and Shavet Zion, while the rituals performed on the waters near Tyre were more varied from a gendered perspective. Those enacted near Shavet Zion can be interpreted as specialized maritime aspects of the religious culture of Phoenician women. These ceremonies at sea took place in relation to the divine feminine, in particular the goddess Tanit, and were rituals that sought sacred protection during critical and vulnerable aspects of the reproduction and futures of Phoenician households and women's religious culture. That is pregnancy, the perinatal phase, and postpartum care for babies and young children. So I'd just like to wind up with words of thanks, especially, of course, support. I've been on sabbatical this fall semester. So big shout out to the Pacific School of Religion for its continued support of my research. I'd also like to thank Michal Artzi, Noah Sheitzov, Meir Edry, Adi Ehrlich, and Asaf Yasser-Lando, whose primary research on the finds from Shavet Zion is fundamental for this presentation. Also Miriam Seco Alvarez and Ibrahim Noureddin, who saved the underwater finds from Tyre and published them, thus sharing them with the scholarly community. So thank you, hats off. Staff at the Bade Museum at Pacific School of Religion for conceptualizing and organizing and implementing this important lecture series, and of course our partners at the Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley. So thank you all, and I look forward to ending my screen share and perhaps answering a few questions.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk on such a rich assemblage. And I want to invite our YouTube audience, people who are watching live, to submit questions and comments that you have. So while a few of those are coming in and we're assembling them, I have a couple questions of my own that I want to start us out with. And the first question, it's kind of basic, and I think the answer will be yes, but it's also important for supporting your argument. So the submerged contexts in which the figurines and pottery deposits are found at Tyre and Shavet Zion, were these originally offshore undersea deposits rather than coastal land sites that have since become submerged with changing shorelines since their deposition?
Oh no, that is a really good question. And yeah, I think that the short answer is yes, they were always underwater. And there of course have been important, and interestingly enough, it is of course the coast that changed geomorphologically so much. So in places like, if you've ever been to the coast of Turkey, for instance, so there are important classical sites that are now, that used to be on the coast that are now 3 kilometers inland, that sort of thing. So it's a very appropriate question. But in this case, and especially around the research of the University of Haifa, dealing with literally the ups and downs of the coastline, I think it's been established that these were underwater then and are underwater now, and then most of the changes are fairly localized and typically are around riverine outlets where there are sediments that build up and things like that. So there, along this particular stretch of coast, there haven't been radical shifts in terms of sea level.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, where else have these female figurines, the Phoenician female figurines, been found, and how do the two assemblages that you've focused on fit within a larger corpus, if there is one, to discuss?
Sure. Well, the figurines are found all over. They're found in higher concentrations in these, sacred deposits called favisse, which are sort of the sacred, trash dumps, basically, from temple sites. So that's the parallels are found in terms of concentration at those important favisse. I'm thinking of ones from Tel Dor. There was a favisse recently-ish excavated in Beirut, for instance. And thank you to Helen Dixon for reminding me of that. And also I want to do a shout out to Helen Dixon for having read an early version of this paper. I appreciate her feedback. Of course, I'll do the usual scholarly thing, which is to say all the mistakes are mine. And then of course, there are interesting sort of Favissa from slightly inland in the Shfela as well. There's a kind of this interesting phenomenon where you get concentrations of Phoenician presence actually inland at the Shfela, probably at these sort of trading hubs. Actually, as Barbara Bolognani has pointed out, there's a difference. These aren't underwater Favissa. So, the nature of a Favissa is that offerings that are given in a temple setting are too sacred to leave in the temple, and so when they get cleaned up, they get ritually deposited, in a trash site, but a sort of sacred trash site. And what's found underwater at Shavet Zion and off of Tyre, these are not just sort of the sweepings out of the trash. These are direct deposits. And so I think Barbara was really correct in pointing out, while there are parallels in terms of sort of the concentration of figurine finds, the depositional parallels are not there. And so they really have to be interpreted differently, despite the sort of presence of, so how they got there is very different. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Speaking of Helen Dixon, lucky for us, she's tuning in today and has submitted a question. So I'm going to read a question from her.
Sure.
She says, thank you so much for this excellent talk. And that her question split across, I don't need to read the whole thing. Okay, she's interested in Carthaginian votive stelae with the ship and the sign of Tanit. If these mark sacrifice, how do you make sense of the image? Or do you think this might indicate that they were requests for replacement children after a miscarriage or death?
Yeah. Of all the sticky issues in Phoenician studies, this may be one of the stickier ones, but first of all, just to sort of back things up, I certainly see those precincts as being the locations of child sacrifice. And on occasion there were substitutes, but it seems to be, given the skeletal remains, although quite tricky, because with babies, newborns, and stillborns even, the bone material is just not set very well, and then of course they were cremated. So but why would you have these maritime reliefs? Well, as Helen knows well, having worked on burials in the homeland, the representations may be less about the interred and more about the living. And so it may be the case that, these were vows made at sea. It may be the case that these were vows, it may be representation sort of the profession of the parents who were doing the sacrificing and the burial. There are, of course, numerous possibilities in terms of the interpretation, but they're fascinating. And it's, given the incredible spread of Phoenician culture in the first millennium, literally across the Mediterranean and even outside of the pillars of Hercules, or Melkart, as the case may be, that just an incredible maritime empire. The amount we know about Phoenician or Punic ships is pretty limited, and that seafaring world, again, we only have sort of small glimpses. So those depictions on those stelae are really treasures, and I think it's really fascinating, for instance, that only parts of the ship sometimes are represented, like the prow or the stern. This is my earlier work, so I don't want to go off too much on it. or things like the steering rudders are represented too. And anchors. I didn't show any of those images, but on occasion we have pictures of anchors on those child sacrifice stelae. So these are all very adult kinds of imagery. And again, I would say related to the adults who were doing, what I would term the ultimate sacrifice. So these, for the deniers out there, it's not like, these groups of Western Phoenicians were wanting to, kill their children. It was quite literally the ultimate sacrifice, just as that set of terms, what it means in English. I think it meant to, these daughter Phoenician colonies that were being stressed in various ways, and this was their way of making right with the divine world.
Thank you. So on the same topic of symbols, a question from Cilantro Ashby, who is a future speaker in this series, who will be giving a talk in April. She asks, or she comments, I see connections between the symbol of Tanit and the Egyptian Ankh sign, meaning life, as well as the Isis knot as part of the attire of Isis. Has anyone discussed connections between these two goddesses?
I'm less familiar with between the two goddesses in specific. There are definitely scholars who looked to the sort of the inspiration for the symbol as being the Ankh. I can't think of, I'm less familiar with that argumentation. First of all, of course, we know that there was a profound influence of Egyptian culture on, in the Bronze Age on the Canaanites, and then in the Iron Age on the Phoenicians. I mean, it's just everywhere. So not only were there, of course, physical connections, traveled between the areas, trade diasporas between the areas. There also clearly was, intellectual borrowings, artistic borrowings, et cetera, et cetera. So whether the Ankh has a direct connection to the sign of Tanit, I'm less familiar with that particular argument. But then there, of course, and especially the later we go in time, there are, as with most polytheistic cultures, there seem to be kind of equivalent, goddesses and gods. And so the ancients were making these kinds of connections. So, I mean, examples that is not from Egyptian literature, where we know, for instance, that there were, again, diaspora Phoenician presence especially in the Delta. But from Greek writings, where they simply, it took Baal, the storm god, and wrote it as Zeus. So they were making the translations in their head and literally on, putting it on paper or papyrus, as the case may be. And I'm sure the same thing was going on. I mean, so besides borrowings from the Egyptian pantheon, the god Bes, for instance, comes to mind, that, the ancients were making these kinds of associations quite freely. So I think that's an area that's very rich for future exploration, but I'm not super familiar with. And of course, the origins of that symbol are discussed in several in several different directions. And I think it may be most honest just to say, like many Phoenician things, it's somewhat ambiguous and highly up to interpretation. But the interconnections between those particular ancient cultures were vast. So,
well, it's a perfect transition to my next question, which is also on this issue of connections. And I'm curious about what kind of relationships you might posit between the Phoenician female figurines and those that have been found in neighboring cultural contexts, like Judean pillar figurines, for example, such as those that have been found at Tel and Nazbe.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, more or less contemporary. Of course, most of the figurines I was showing are a little bit later, Persian period, but we certainly have earlier Phoenician figurines that are contemporary with the pillar figurines. And it's interesting because you get, differences in terms of manufacturing procedures, which is not too surprising. You get differences in terms of stylistic. So you get sort of regional differences, which is part of the reason why we can call, one corpus Judean, because it's primarily from the region of Judah. One corpus, Phoenician, because it's primarily from the coastal areas, from Cyprus, and then of course from the daughter colonies as well. There are differences. We have Ammonite figurines, for instance, but and also North Syrian, very important corpus of Iron Age, late Iron Age figurines. What's interesting though is, so you do get these, definite regional differences. We can kind of give them national or ethnic names, if you want to call that, but that oftentimes the poses are similar. So we have, for instance, Phoenician figurines of women who are supporting their breasts. And that's, that's universal for the Judean pillar figurines. And that's also symbolism that's found, for instance, on Syrian figures, and all the way down into the Roman period. So, and also men on horseback. It's it's ubiquitous, right? Stylistically, we can tell, a Cypriot version, perhaps a Phoenician version, and, and then of course the Judean version, et cetera, et cetera. But again, there's, I hate to use the word universal, but I might as well. I might get myself in trouble, but whatever these needs these figurines were serving seems to have been ubiquitous, right, across the families of the ancient world. Because of course, most of these, even if they're found in, highfalutin contexts, are they're the cheap knockoffs. These are the inexpensive votive offerings that could be used in everyday practices and afforded by common families. But to me, it's interesting that, and again, we get our sort of stylistic regional differences, but oftentimes the motifs, I guess I would say, are similar. And I think that has to do, again, with the sorts of sacred needs of the users, which is a kind of common human set of sacred concerns. Yeah.
On a related note, one final question to wrap this up for today. I'm thinking now of the really excellent recent work by Lauren McCormick on surface decoration and painting on the Judean pillar figurines. Again, some of which are from the assemblage at Nazve and the Bade Museum collection, which is why I'm thinking of her work. But my question is, have there been any studies yet on surface decoration or more details about manufacturing technique or painting on the assemblage that you're looking at from Phoenicia?
It's certainly not on these underwater assemblages. I'm going to defer to Lauren. So I know that there has been some very important work on choroplastic. I'm forgetting the technical term, but coloring, and I believe that that's been done mostly on classical figurines, mostly by a French researcher, and I pardon me, I'm forgetting their name. But so it's starting, and I think it's a great reminder, and Lauren's work has just been sort of blazing trails here, which is that just like the geomorphology of the coastline, what we're looking at today might not be what was there in antiquity, right? And that the coloration of these ancient figurines, even for these, what I've already referred to as sort of the cheap knockoffs, that the coloration may have been extremely important. And so we're only getting a kind of part of the picture. So, Lauren's work on one figurine head from our collection, of course, it's a Judean pillar figurine, it's not a Phoenician, figurine, but the impact that the coloration, especially around the eyes, has on a modern viewer, presumably, that was there, of course, in antiquity, And so that sort of quite literally layer of meaning is mostly missing from the modern, our modern views of these ancient common statuettes. Polychromy, that's the word I'm looking for. So I'm hoping that, and of course, no surprise, the polychromy studies that have been done are primarily on, major stone sculptures and this kind of thing. I guess there may have been a little bit of work done there, these, amazing, a little bit later in time, but sarcophagi from Sidon, where some of the color is still actually extant, which is wonderful. And also contemporary sarcophagi from the carved sarcophagi from the island of Cyprus. But that I think it's quite humbling, actually, when we consider, again, we're trying to come up with these interpretations of these artifacts, but it's not the same kind of thing that the ancients were looking at and interacting with. And it's humbling to remember that and to try and, move forward in, I already feel like a lot of what I presented has been sort of interpretations on interpretations. But there's science behind what the kind of work Lauren is doing and researchers in France. But there's also sort of highly interpretive elements to polychromy. And of course, as moderns, we have to be extremely careful. I would just add a note of caution, especially around skin coloring. There's a whole, very loud controversy, over the colorization of classical, pure white marble statues and its effect. But how we researchers, how we choose to represent skin color is highly interpretive and can be highly sensitive. So I'll just put a kind of general warning. Alfred, again, doesn't mean it shouldn't be done, but it should be done with sensitivity. And I'd hate to see polychromy whitewash the ancient world. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's such an important consideration. I just want to add a comment here that is from Laura McCormick, who's also watching right now in the live stream. She says, thanks for the shout out. I agree, there's so much more to learn based on color. So on that note, I'm going to once again thank our speaker, Professor Erin Brody, for contributing to the Women and Gender Performance Lecture Series. And I would like to invite everyone to join us again as the series resumes in the new year. Our next talk will be January 12th, 2023 with Dr. Kristine Garroway, whose talk is titled Raising Children in Ancient Israel. So we hope that you all join us again then and look